Hello, my name is Patrick, I'm a sculptor, and recently I made an owlbear. So, let me tell you a story. In my very first D&D experience, I was in a campaign. I had a character who was a bit impulsive, a bit stupid, and sometimes made really bad choices. And when we came upon an owlbear deep in a dungeon, I took it upon myself, because I had the initiative, to dimension door myself onto the back of this owlbear. Not the best idea, and particularly bad because my friends, or who I thought were my friends, one by one all took their turn, seeing a door that we could leave through and the owlbear couldn't fit through. They just sort of left. One by one, they disappeared deeper into the dungeon, left me on the back, and I took a few hits. Probably because my DM was a nice guy, and it was my first time really experiencing a lot of these things, and so I survived barely. All this to say that I have a special place in my heart for the owlbear, so I decided to make one. Let me show you how I did it. I started by building myself a base. I used some foil and some clay. I textured some rocky terrain and vibes, adding rocks, grass, and leaves. The key to kicking off this owlbear is the wireframe armature. I covered it in foil and began covering it in clay. I also loosely added clay for the general shape of the arms and the legs. I made the basic shape of the head, on which I could eventually design the full head. At this stage, I was able to test and position the body and the limbs on my base. It is important to do this early and often so you can be confident in the final form. With the basic body, I began shaping in the head by building out a sort of heart-shaped, flat surface. I used a large ball stylus to create the cavities in which the eyes will eventually be placed. For the beak, I made a hole in the center of the face and rolled out 2 thin cones of clay for the upper and lower beak. I added the upper beak and then added the lower beak underneath. I made 2 sockets for eyes and filled them with 2 balls of clay and lined them with a thin layer of clay for eyelids. Now it was time to begin texturing the face. Using a flat tool with a triangular point, I pressed the triangular tip into the face, repeating this along the shape of the face, connecting the corners of the triangles as I moved along. Once that row was done, I moved down and continued the process, but staggered the triangles in each row. This creates a layered feather look. As I progressed on the face, I began to make triangles larger and larger, and when satisfied, I went back and cleaned up the details. I carried this pattern along the shape of the face, repeating on both sides and along the top of the head. Going down the neck, I used the straight edge of my tool to cut semicircle shapes along the ridge of the neck, layering and staggering them as to reflect tightly layered feathers. I shaped 2 long triangles for eyebrows and attached them just above the eye. And with that, the head was basically done. Next, I moved on to shaping the raised hand. I built up the material for the palm, added 5 tubes of clay for the fingers and thumb, and blended them in. Then I created holes for claws at the tips of each finger and rolled out thin cones of clay for claws, adding them to the hands. I then followed a similar pattern to the head to shape in some feathers, following the shape of the arm from the upper arm to the wrist and repeating that on both arms. And with that, I was ready to begin prepping the sculpture to be added to the base. This meant it was time to feather the underbelly. And so I made about 500 feathers. And to be honest, that wasn't even enough. You can make your own feathers by hand, but when you're making about 400 feathers, you need to find a way to save time. Enter the mold. I made a few feathers and used some silicone rubber to create a mold of them. With the mold, I could easily make feathers by adding some clay and rolling it into the mold with my ball stylus. I repeated this process again and again until I had enough feathers, and when I ran out, I could do it again and again as many times as I needed to. When feathering, I try to think about how I want to layer them. Where would the highest feather be? In this case, I assume the highest feathers would be at the top of the body when thinking vertically, and in the middle of the body when thinking horizontally. This meant I needed to build feathers from the bottom of the sculpture and from the outsides in. And so the feathering began. Once the feathers were in place on the underside of my owlbear, I could think about attaching it to the base. I positioned the hand and the feet, and began replicating the process of making hands with claws for each of the hands and the feet. Unlike the raised claw, I needed to think about the position relative to the rock and how it was gripping the piece. Now that the owlbear was in place, I ran a strip of feathers along the arm, stacking from the front to the back on both the top and the bottom of the arm. All that remained now was feathering. I layered horizontally towards the middle and from the bottom up. Here's a quick montage. Once the feathers were in, I did some detail work using my straight edge to blend the feather texture into the individually made feathers, and finally built up the shoulders with layered feathers in a circular shape, sort of like feather pauldrons. And with that, the project is ready to bake. Now usually this is the point where I would show you how I painted this project, but I did a more detailed paint job than usual, so I thought I'd separate this video into two, giving you the sculpting guide this week and the painting guide next week. That said, let me show you the final result. And with that, I'm pleased with how the owlbear turned out. It was a lot of feathers, like a lot of feathers. So glad that I had this mold. It saved me about 1 million hours of work, which was really great. I'm excited to bring you the painting process next week. But before we wrap up, let me ask you, what monster stands out in your mind from your earliest D&D experiences? Mine was the owlbear. What is your monster that really just sort of grips your imagination because of that first experience of D&D? I'd love to do more monsters like these in the future. Give me a like and let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see next. I'd love to do stuff that you want to see. I also have a Twitch stream, so if you enjoyed this video, you probably would enjoy the Twitch stream as well. Twitch.tv/SutherlandHandmade. I'd love to see you there. We're forming a little community of people who love to watch art and love to make art. It's a good time, and I'd love to see you in chat. Feel free to drop in, say hello. And of course, till next time, Keep being awesome.